Well, hey, everybody, welcome to the Seeing Ability podcast, where we're having a conversation about the world of people with differing abilities. And that means in some cases, we're going to be talking to adults who were that kid who grew up with a disability. We're going to be talking to a lot of parents who are raising families with disabilities and a ton of people that support this community. It could be folks in education, could be folks in nonprofits and in healthcare. And first of all, I know you got a lot of choices when it comes to where you spend your super valuable free time. Thanks for tuning in and listening to us. The name of the podcast, Seeing Ability, is what if we had a lens where every time we saw a person, we didn't notice their disability. We took those first three letters off and we noticed their ability. So I'm super glad you're with us today. I think you're going to love having my guest, Dr. Emma Basch, is with me today. And you'll hear a little bit about why she's here in a minute. But Emma, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I told you before we got started that before we dig into our topic at hand, we want to just get to know you a little bit. So we have our Fast Four. Now, my friends at Reliable Tech Help are underwriting the Fast Four. So for your computer needs, reach out to them. They're at 502-797-7399. Our first of the Fast Four is an easy one. Might make some of you hungry out there. What's your favorite food?
Okay, I feel like my answer is weird, but I couldn't decide. It's either olives or dark chocolate, which definitely don't go together, but I really I would
So
put them both up there.
kind of depends on your mood. Olives,
Yes,
dark chocolate.
savory
Okay,
and sweet.
so the next time somebody sees you, they're going to say, "Is this an olive kind of day or a dark chocolate kind of day?"
That'll tell you a lot about me. Yes, I like
Okay,
it.
very good. If we took a look at your playlist, what kind of music would we find?
You would find a very eclectic playlist. I've been heavily influenced by my tweens, so there's a lot of Taylor Swift and Beyonce on there, but I'm also like a 90s baby, so I've got a lot of like 90s hip hop and 90s indie rock on there as well.
Okay, a lot of good music from the 90s. Okay, number three, you have your choice, a TV show. This is a judgment-free zone, by the way, a book or a movie that you've been enjoying lately.
I've been watching a lot of TV at night. That's kind of how I chill out. I've really been enjoying it's a new show called The Pit. I don't know if this is
Okay.
familiar with this, the medical drama.
I've heard of that show. I saw someone post on social media that they said they think Noah Wiley must be a real doctor because he's got such a good handle on what it's like to be in the ER.
Really wild. I feel like he probably is. And I saw an article that like actual ER doctors are saying the show is pretty accurate. So for whatever reason, that is how I'm like recharging at night. But I'm
So,
really,
No- so
it's really
Noah, if you're listening, props to you and the Pit. Great show. And then last but not least, think of somewhere you've been, like for a vacation, when you've gone to unwind in the last year. What was your favorite place and why did you love it so much?
I was lucky enough to take a trip with my family, so my husband and my kids to New Orleans, and I loved it. And I think I hadn't been there since I was much younger and before having kids, but being able to experience the culture of the city with
Yeah.
my children and kind of seeing them light up with the music and the art, as well as doing some like hard history with them to really, it was sort of the first time we were able to do that. It was kind of a powerful, but also really fun trip and obviously like great food as well. So that was great.
That sounds really fun. Well, I'm excited to have all my guests, but you in particular, because I think you're from a realm of this journey of parenting and raising kids who are different that is not as discussed as much as I would like, and that's the mental health realm. So tell our audience who you are, kind of what's your day job, and how do you connect to this world of parenting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a clinical psychologist. I specialize in mostly perinatal mental health, so around pregnancy, birth, and postpartum and parenting. And so I kind of fell into doing work with parents of kids with special needs or medical complexity, sort of through that route where I was getting patients coming to me. When their child was in the NICU, or perhaps they received a difficult diagnosis during pregnancy, or sort of an early developmental diagnosis when their child was quite young. And I've been doing this work a while, so I've been able to kind of walk alongside many parents throughout this journey of raising children, sometimes from like diagnosis to, elementary and entering into middle school. So that's kind of how I found my way into this work. And then I think things just become generative. So I think people started to seek me out when they knew that I did this, and started to do more and more of it. So it's really in supporting parents through this journey.
I feel like I met you about 25 years too late. My daughter is about to turn 25, but as many of the listeners know, I got thrown into that world. My wife and I, the way the story goes, I was at work. I worked at the local United Way here in Kentucky where I live, and we were doing one of those all staff retreats, where you close your eyes and do the trust fall and all that stuff. And I was on the planning committee. We had the skits, we had everything ready. It was Wednesday afternoon. My wife had one of her prenatal visits, and I said, our retreat is tomorrow morning. I've been gone for a week. We had just gotten back from a trip overseas. And I said, I really need to be at this meeting. Call me when you're done. Well, I didn't get a call from her. I got a call from the doctor's office, meet her at the hospital. This was 25 and a half weeks into her pregnancy. And 3 days later, Sophia was born. 10 weeks in the NICU, and people didn't know whether normally they're passing, saw the people passing out cigars and celebrating. Our delivery was more like a car crash, and people didn't know whether to congratulate us or say I'm sorry. So that trial by fire, visceral entry into the NICU world is something many of our listeners have that in their background, or people they know, especially if they work in this field. So that whole NICU experience, tell me about that piece of your practice and how you're helping parents navigate that.
It's a huge piece of my practice, kind of for exactly the reason that you said, that a lot of people's journey through this world of parenting starts there. And most of the time, that's an unexpected start, right? There are the instances where someone knows they're going to have a child with medical complexity and they're sort of prepped. But most of the time, that's the first shockwave, for lack of a better way to put it, is people are not expecting, whether it's an early delivery or just something that happens that goes wrong, or everything goes right and then something happens with their child. It's a real crash between your expectation of what something is going to look like and the reality. And there is no space or time, which I think is a really hard and unique aspect of the NICU. Like, boom, it is all hands on deck. And no one has time to take that breath and process. So when parents are coming to me, sometimes it's after the NICU experience.
Right.
Their child is out, they're finally breathing a little and realize, oh my goodness, I have so much trauma and fear from this experience. Sometimes they're coming to me when their child is in the NICU, if their kiddo is there for a long time, they're kind of recognizing, or maybe someone has told them, maybe you could use some additional support. But I would say across the board, folks are dealing with the experience of trauma, of exhaustion, of mental and physical wear and tear. The visceralness of the NICU. And my daughter spent some time there as well. And if I can hear it. If I like get myself quiet enough, I can hear the beeping, right? I can sort of visualize the lights that really, really sticks with you. So a lot of what I'm doing with parents, first of all, when they come to me, is helping them stop, right? That they finally get that moment to start to metabolize what has happened to them. Focus has been on their baby, right? And I get that, right? Like, all hands on deck to help make sure this baby is getting the care that they need. But parents are pretty neglected or not seen in that experience, and routinely are just pushing themselves past their own capacity because they are, all hands on that baby.
Yeah, in your experience, when people come to you, is it kind of an eye opener? Are most people aware that they've experienced a trauma, or aware that they have all these emotions, or had they just, like I said, been so focused on everything else that once you start to talk to them, it unravels what they really have gone through?
It's usually the latter.
Mhm.
Unless somebody had maybe a little bit more experience with therapy before and kind of knows their own signals that they need some support. It's
Right.
usually the latter, that someone suggests they may need some therapy, or they're coming to me because they're noticing all these triggers, right? Let's say their child has left the NICU and they are really still struggling to cope. They're kind of will come to me, and then it's almost a surprise to them, although it makes sense quickly, that they are metabolizing those days, weeks, months sometimes of experience that they were most likely parents in sort of a fight, flight, just rush
Right.
coping with all of this, that now there's maybe a little bit of breathing room, or not always, because some kiddos have a lot of medical complexity when they leave, but maybe a little bit more space to start to recognize that this thing happened to them too, right? It's not just their child, it happened to them too, and they got to deal with that.
I would be curious to know how often has you think of all the people that are all hands on deck in this situation, the neonatologists, the surgeons, the pediatricians, the social workers, the discharge planners in the hospital. They get a lot of resources, a lot of support, and connected with therapy and referrals and everything. What percentage of the time is part of that conversation? Oh, we need to refer some mental health services because mom and dad are going through quite a bit. Is that even part of the conversation?
I think it happens, but it really doesn't happen enough. And, I think probably some NICUs are sort of better resourced with enough, social workers and people on staff for that to happen. But I think what often happens, or what I hear, is that it happens in a way that is sort of doesn't have enough intentionality or follow through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, kind, compassionate doctors or social workers or nurses might say, like, maybe you should get some support. But when a parent is like, again, all not sleeping, just so focused on their baby, they need more than that. They need someone to like sit down and say, I'm going to help you make this appointment. Or like, here is this group. How can we get you to this group for parents? So, unless I think someone's kind of hand is held through that process, getting that care is just so hard, right? And parents are going to neglect that, I think,
Yeah,
too. Like me, okay, sure, but right now my focus is on my baby. So I just think there needs to be more resource and follow through to make sure people land where they need to land.
I love that. You talked about the shock of it and the difference between what you expected things to be like, and then suddenly they were. And for a lot of parents, I think the first chapter in the book I wrote last year was on acceptance. Kind of
Mm,
dealing with the process of emotions of the fact that you're on a different path. The famous "Welcome to Holland" that's written. Um, there's a grief process with that, and so talk about that acceptance, that processing emotions, grief, lots of different labels, that part of the journey, how prevalent it is it for the families you work with, and what has been your observation with that? And then I guess the follow-up is like, what advice do you have for parents about working through that piece of it?
yeah, that's a really great question. I would say it's like kind of present in every parent that I've worked with. It's just they use different language, or are more willing to acknowledge it or less willing to acknowledge it, right? Like
Mm,
I think the grief component, or that struggle with acceptance, there's this layer of I shouldn't feel that way. I'm not allowed to feel that way. Whether that's coming from guilt or shame, whether that's coming, sometimes it's coming from that sort of toxic positivity, like, well, my baby
mm,
survived, right? They're alive. I shouldn't have these secondary feelings. And what we
mm,
know about emotion, and this is not sort of unique to this experience, is that's not how that works, right? Our feelings are sort of natural expressions of our psychological processes. They're not bad, they're not good, they just are. And so I think that grief, right? We have to kind of understand that grieving something doesn't mean you don't love your child, doesn't mean you don't accept your child. I help parents talk about like sort of what we are grieving, right? Some
mm,
and I think sometimes that helps create a little distance, right? We're not grieving, oh, I don't want this child to love our child. We're grieving like again, that difference between what I expected and what's happening, right?
mm,
I wanted this beautiful delivery, as you said, like the smoking cigars, getting the flowers. Here I am, not sleeping in this really scary place. We can grieve that, right?
mm,
We can grieve, I thought my child was going to be like this, and now they're like this. We can grieve that without it meaning anything about your child. We can grieve, I thought my life was going to look like this, and now I'm understanding it's going to have to look different, right? We can sort of grieve these different processes. And I work with parents on accepting grief, kind of understanding what grief is and what it isn't. Allowing grief, right? Sometimes we need rituals or different ways to grieve, right? We do that with death, right? We have funerals or things like that. We give ourselves permission. Got to give yourself permission to go through your feelings. And what I find is the more we give ourselves permission and we drop that struggle with guilt, the more we're able to move through them and work on acceptance. And
mm.
acceptance doesn't have to mean I'm happy about this, right? Acceptance doesn't have to mean I like this right now. Acceptance is this is what's happening right now. And if I get out of my struggle with I shouldn't feel this way, I can meet this moment much better, right? I can show up for myself, for my child, for my family so much better if I'm not stuck in this battle with what I should or shouldn't feel. So I feel like I have conversations with folks about this in this like linear way that also takes time and it comes up again. This is the other thing I tell parents to expect, and is that you're going to have experiences with grief along your journey because there are going to be developmental moments, right? Your child enters kindergarten. Oh, here's another marker of what I thought things would be and what they are,
Yeah.
right? Your child is an adolescent. Oh, right, right. Like that's so normal. And so to expect not doing it wrong when the grief comes up, you're just exactly where you need to be on that journey. So let's meet that moment with some acceptance and compassion.
I think that's so important because I think sometimes people can think that grief or acceptance is a one-time event and it's a process. When I was doing research for the book, I talked to parents who said, I'm in my 50s and most of my peers, their kids are growing up and leaving the house and they're empty nesters. She said,
Yeah,
my nest will never be empty.
right.
And coming to terms, and I feel bad for feeling that. Again, it seems like grief comes with a heavy dose of guilt, usually next to it.
I think it really, really often comes with a heavy dose of guilt. So I really work with folks on how whether we let go of the guilt or we find some acceptance around the guilt, we reframe the guilt. We kind of have a lot of different sort of like therapy strategies for navigating it. But ultimately, the goal is to put down the guilt in the service of feeling your feelings so you can move through them and get back to whatever the values are, right? How you want to be in your life and as a parent and all your other identities. So the guilt shuts it all down,
Yeah.
right? It's like you're engaging. I think I tell people sometimes like you're playing tug of war with that guilt. Like what happens if you drop your side of the rope, right? You don't have to play that game anymore. You can just be with your feelings. That's hard, right? I'm not saying that's easy, but that's how you move through it.
Yeah, and you deal obviously with a lot of folks in mental health issues in general, and people being in touch with all these things going on. Most of us are not real good at it. We're not taught to do it from an early age. We're, feeling these kind of feelings, we just kind of ignore them or we stuff them down or we don't want to pretend they exist. And then you compound that with the extra challenges and extra emotions of special needs parenting, and you have a recipe for a lot of complication.
So much complication. Yes. I also love to remind people kind of exactly what you said that, like, we're not good at this, and that's okay. I'm not good at this. None of us are good at this. We have to learn, just like we learn any other skill. We have
Yeah.
to practice how to do this. And when you have a child, whether they have additional needs or not, you have to embrace the beginner's mind. You've never done this before. So now
Right.
we're saying, do this, and your child may have some complexity, and you've got these hard feelings not supposed to know how to do that. That's okay, right? We wouldn't expect you to just like get behind the wheel and know how to drive. So it's an also just like that beginner's mind, right? I'm new at this. That
Mm.
helps as well build a little bit of space around those hard feelings.
Yeah, and then if you take that mindset, you're less hard on yourself that you're screwing it up every 2 minutes.
Totally, totally, which serves everybody, right? Like, I know sometimes we think being hard on ourselves will motivate us to do better. It doesn't work. We just feel bad. Right? Like if it worked, we would know. Really, you just feel bad. So it does create more self-compassion, which is just so helpful throughout this whole process for everybody to be gentle with themselves.
Yeah, that's so powerful. So we talked about all this fight or flight, all this kind of thing that happens early on in the journey. How
Mm.
does that impact a topic that I talked about? And actually, when I was working on my book, it was on my list of topics that came out in all the conversations. But ironically, I found it was like down at number 8. And I moved it up to like the third chapter in my book because we always put it down at the bottom. And that's this concept it's the oxygen mask, it's self care. You
Yeah.
see that probably with all your patients with self care issues, but with parents in general, there's another complicated layer, and then parents on this differing path. How do you see it come about, and how do they get graded on their ability to have self care?
I think it's really, really hard. And I think it is a missing piece. And I think there's a lot of barriers to self-care for parents, and certainly for parents who have kids with special needs or kids with medical complexity or kids who are still in the NICU. There are external barriers, right? Like time is a huge
Right.
one. Money, although we can talk about why that doesn't have to be. There's also internal barriers, right? And those are the ones we work on a lot in therapy. Guilt, right? I shouldn't make time for myself. Um, Shame around self-care, lack of value, right? Some people sort of see it as frivolous because sometimes it's framed that way.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a bargaining, right? Like when someone's kid is really sick, there's this feeling of selfishness of directing any kind of energy towards yourself. And I will say there's a resources difficulty, right? Like I know that for a lot of people who have kids with different needs, like getting good childcare that they feel good about, or like who
Mhm.
has the skill set to navigate their child's physical or emotional needs can be really challenging, right? Not everyone has the supports that I wish everybody had of like a community that
Right.
wanted to pitch in and give them space. So these barriers are real, and I don't want to say otherwise. But what I try to hone in with people is like, what is self-care, right? It
Mm.
doesn't have to mean, and I actually think this is a really sort of watered down version, like bath bombs or like going to get a massage or like, that's great. If that's your jam and you have time and space for that, like great. But I think about self-care is spending some time directing that emotional oxygen towards yourself and connecting with whatever your needs are. And if we think about it that way, that doesn't have to take a tremendous amount of time. That doesn't have to cost money, right? It doesn't really have to require childcare, although, how great to be able to go for a walk by yourself or whatever that is. So I really talk with people about like, let's hone in on the meaning. Like, what does that mean if we think about like, what are your needs that you're having trouble accessing? What does it
Mm.
feel like to direct that emotional oxygen towards yourself? Then we can find some simple things. And then I talk with clients about how we make that a regular practice, right? So this
Mm.
could be things I've done with clients are things like, okay, we're going to make sure you have that morning cup of coffee alone. So maybe we found a way that like maybe you're getting up a few minutes earlier or relying on a partner, some way that you're having that 2 minutes where you're just going to focus on like the taste and the smell and the quiet, right? Something really simple like that. Or maybe it's like, I'm going to take a shower, but I'm going to be intentional to like smell the soap, or feel my feeling, or feel my body, or feel my feelings, like these very, very small ways. Or maybe I'm just going to be nice to myself, right? And
Mm.
that self-nurture is a form of self-care. And these are much more accessible than some of the other acts that are great. Hopefully, most people eventually will get into a degree of routine where they might find more time to do things like physical movement. I talk with people about joyful movement, not formal exercise, because there are so many types of movement that can be healing. Maybe that's stretching, maybe it's going for a run, maybe it's a yoga class, maybe it's whatever, dancing with your kid. But it might take some time to get there, particularly if we're talking about like transitioning out of the NICU. And so I like to think like small but meaningful to start, and then gradually just adding to that as you have a little bit more of a sense of your feet underneath you.
I think you've got a lot of people looking for the coffee now that you had that. You had me right there. You're talking about the smell of it, or they're either wanting to get a cup of coffee right now or take a nice long shower with some
Yeah.
good scents in the shower, maybe eucalyptus, that kind of thing. Everybody's like,
Mhm.
I'm right there. I'm going to pause this podcast and go get my coffee. Hopefully the idea that they're listening to this podcast is a form of self-care,
I
right?
think so, right? Like making the space to do that, it does not have to be time intensive, right? We can like flexibility is so key here. And then working again on those internal barriers. What are your reasons why it feels difficult emotionally
Yeah.
to provide yourself with some care?
That's so helpful because I think intellectually most people know it's a concept. I mean, they get once you really think about the oxygen mask example, then it makes sense.
Yeah,
It's kind of counterintuitive. And if you think like, well, I can't use my phone because the battery's low, we're the same way, right? If our battery and,
absolutely.
and there's unintended consequences because it's not just that you're tired, it's that maybe you have less patience. You don't show up as your best self. I think
Totally.
somebody said when I was working on my book that you can't pour from an empty cup. you
I
know?
think that's so smart. I love that expression. It's so true, right? Like parental burnout, but also caregiver burnout, right? Like are
Right,
so real. And when you have a child with different needs, like you are a parent and you are a caregiver in a different way. So you're
right.
sort of like doubly at risk for that emotional burnout.
Yeah, I feel like we could have you back for 7 or 8 episodes because there's so much of this part of the journey. And really, like researching my book, doing this podcast, all the themes I talk about, this piece of how it deals with the mental health aspects is a huge one. I'm going to do one kind of big wrap up thing, but I'm going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. When you have a kid who is different, all your ducks need to be in a row, especially your money. Cam Howell with Primerica knows the joys and challenges as he and his wife raise their medically fragile son, Brooks. Cam brings over 13 years of experience to help his clients be protected, have a plan for the future, reduce debt, and connect to resources. Get your financial house in order so that you can enjoy every moment with your child. Reach out to Cam today at 502 803 5075. And now back to the show. So, with all my guests, I always like to do kind of a big picture summary thing. This is probably a really realistic scenario that we would bring somebody like you into a parent group, maybe a support group where we work at a children's hospital and we've got maybe 30, 40 parents in the room and they have kids that are 5 or less. And they have a variety of different challenges, but they're all in this like different path, if you will. And you're up there at the podium, and this is a gross oversimplification. But if you had to say, what are 3 to 5 big keys to success for the goal that all parents have, which is helping your child become their best young adult they could one day be?
I love this question. I have a bunch of ideas, but I think there are a couple core ones that then you could sort of like build on. I think the first one I would really tell parents is that your your success sort of like that's going to be the key to your kid's success. So take care of yourself, right? Like in that self-care piece is actually probably where I'd start because if that's your goal, right? That's one of those ways in which parents deprioritize their own cares. They're so focused on that child. Can't help that child succeed if you are not taking care of yourself. So that's number one is that I'll use your oxygen mask. Put that oxygen mask. Really, really think about what that means and be intentional about doing that. Um, be flexible. Flexible mindset, I think, is key on this journey. Um, you're starting off usually in an unexpected place, and the paths are windy, right?
Mm,
Like you think you're going one way and then you're going another way. And it doesn't mean you're going it doesn't, who knows? It could be a great direction, could be a challenging direction. It's just never how anybody like thinks it will be because we can't know. And so I think about it's a silly metaphor, but like the buildings that are built to withstand earthquakes, right? They have to sway or they're going to get toppled over. If you are
mm,
super rigid, right, or inflexible about how things need to look or what that timeline is going to look like, you're going to get knocked over. So being really adopting that flexibility in your mindset, that ability to kind of sway is really going to help you and your child thrive.
mhm.
Community. I find a lot of my folks feel really isolated. And that's a real challenge. And I know, we have more access to like the open world, but like you might have to find it online if there's no one, depending on where you live. You may have to find it in, sort of in an online community, but ideally you find some in your local community of parents who are on similar journeys, but maybe different stages. It just feels good to be seen by other people as much as it's useful to have sort of like the guidance and scaffolding that other people can provide, but being mirrored by somebody that kind of sees what your experience is also going to help you set your child up for success. Um,
Mhm.
Lastly, just self-compassion. Like I really think all people need to be better at this. Like be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with yourself because you deserve it, but also it's going to help you be a better parent.
I love those. Wow, that is fantastic. I know that there's going to be a lot of people listening that are like, I feel like I need more of Emma in my life. If folks, I don't know if you guys are taking patients or how that goes, but if folks just wanted to reach out to you, is it social media? Is it a website? How would they learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should have said I'm based in Washington, D.C., but I run a group practice. There are 10 of us. We kind of
Mhm.
all have this experience. And because telehealth laws are cool, we can help clients in about 43 states in the US. So we
Mhm.
are taking patients. You can find, if you Google my name, Emma Basch, you can find our website. You can find me on Instagram or Facebook. We have for the practice, which is called Dr. Emma Basch and Associates. Folks can reach out. We are really happy to help or direct people to resources or just reach out and let me know how you thought the podcast was. Like, I really love to connect with others. I'm very passionate about this. So, love to hear from people.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate you guys listening in today. And I kind of am going to ask if you enjoyed this episode, but I'm pretty sure you did because I know I did, and I can just see a lot of you. We might need a chiropractor to sponsor the podcast because there's a lot of nodding going on, a lot of heads going up and down. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with others. We want to get this information, especially this vital information about taking care of yourself, being gentle on yourself, this mental health piece, which is so under talked about. We want to have everybody hear this episode. So go to our Facebook page, when we post this episode, like that post, maybe leave a comment, and most importantly, share it and follow the podcast. And if you're part of a parent group, a support group, a community, like Dr. Bash said about that village, share it with the village and say, hey, check this out. The goal when I started this podcast, which I actually didn't plan to start, was to provide a forum where we could educate and you could learn something every episode. I think all of us need that little dose of inspiration. So, a little bit of motivation and inspiration from every guest. And then, third, most importantly, become a layer of your community. It is an isolating journey. And I think my ideal goal is that people say, I like listening to this podcast because these are people who get me and they understand me. And it's just one more layer of my community. So, we're looking for future guests. Right now, we're doing 2 episodes a month. One is an individual, like we had today, and the other is an organization, typically a nonprofit that's doing good work in this space. We would love your ideas of people that for future guests. Reach out to me on the Facebook page and leave me a message there. Dr. Bash, Emma, great to have you on. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. This was truly a pleasure. So nice to spend time with you.
Again, we'd love your support. Follow the Facebook page and the podcast, and we'll see everybody next time.